The Mongol Empire wasn't built on horses. It was built on a financial system no empire had ever used before. Think about it. Genghis Khan commanded an army of maybe 100,000 men, 100,000. And with that relatively tiny force, he conquered and controlled hundreds of millions of people across the largest contiguous land empire in human history. An empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. How? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't just superior tactics, it wasn't just psychological warfare, or those legendary mounted archers. Those things mattered, sure. But here's what history books won't tell you. The Mongol Empire had figured out something that wouldn't be fully understood for another 700 years. They'd cracked the code on making war pay for itself. They'd invented a system where conquest didn't drain resources, it multiplied them. And that secret, that financial innovation, didn't just build the largest empire the world had ever seen. It created the blueprint for how modern powers still finance warfare today. This is the story nobody teaches. The hidden machinery behind the hordes. The financial system that turned nomadic raiders into the most sophisticated economic power of the medieval world. And once you see it, you'll never look at military spending the same way again. Welcome to Conflict Capital, where we follow the money behind every war. Here's the thing about empires. They collapse. Almost all of them. And they collapse for the same boring reason. Money. Because conquest is expensive. Catastrophically expensive. You need to feed armies, equip them, move them across impossible distances. And even if you win, even if you take the city and plant your flag, the costs don't stop. They accelerate. Now you have to garrison the place, defend it, administer it. And while you're doing that, your army isn't conquering new territory, which means no new plunder, no new tribute. The cash flow stops, but the bills keep coming. This is the empire death spiral. It's killed more kingdoms than any enemy army ever could. Look at Alexander the Great, brilliant general. Conquered everything from Greece to India. But his empire fell apart the moment he died. Why? Because he'd built it on momentum, on constant forward movement. Stop moving, stop winning, and the whole thing implodes. Take Rome in its final centuries. They had the best army in the world, but they couldn't afford to use it. The cost of defending the frontiers exceeded the wealth those frontiers could generate. So they debased their currency, which caused inflation, which made the soldiers unreliable, which meant they needed more soldiers, which cost more money. Spiral, collapse. The math is simple and brutal. Traditional conquest follows this formula. The cost of taking territory plus the cost of holding territory eventually exceeds the value of that territory. When that happens, expansion stops. And when expansion stops, the empire starts eating itself from the inside. This is why most empires were either constantly conquering or slowly dying. There was no sustainable middle ground. The Mongols faced this same equation. Actually, they faced it worse than anyone. They were nomads from one of the most resource-poor regions on Earth. The steppes of Mongolia couldn't sustain large populations, couldn't produce sophisticated weapons or armor, couldn't feed massive armies indefinitely. By every traditional calculation, the Mongols should have been a flash in the pan. Maybe they raid a few Chinese border towns. Maybe they cause some trouble in Central Asia. That's how it was supposed to go. But Genghis Khan looked at that same impossible equation and saw something different. He saw a system that could be re-engineered, a way to make the math work in reverse. And what he built changed everything. Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. The Mongols didn't invent new weapons. They didn't discover some magical military tactic. What they invented was a financial structure that made expansion self-sustaining. 3 core innovations, each one brilliant, together unstoppable. First, they transformed tribute into a tax system. Now, this sounds boring, but stay with me, because this is where the genius lives. Every empire took tribute from conquered peoples. That's not new, but tribute is crude. It's basically sophisticated robbery. You show up with an army, demand payment, take what you can carry, and leave. It's a one-time extraction, and it creates a major problem because the conquered territory has no incentive to rebuild, no incentive to prosper. You've just taken everything of value. The Mongols flipped this completely. When they conquered a region, they didn't just loot it, they conducted a census, an actual systematic counting of every household, every asset, every field, every head of livestock. In the 1330s, they counted nearly 2 million households across northern China alone. They knew exactly what each region could produce. Then they did something revolutionary. They set fixed tax rates, not arbitrary tribute, not give us whatever we want, fixed, predictable rates. If you were a farmer in a Mongol-conquered territory, you knew exactly what you owed. Every year, the same amount, which meant if you worked harder, if you improved your land, if you produced more, you kept the surplus. This created an incentive structure. Conquered peoples could actually prosper under Mongol rule. And when they prospered, the Mongols collected more taxes, not through higher rates, through growth. It's the same principle modern governments use today. But in 1235, it was revolutionary. Second, innovation. Mobile logistics financing. The Mongols built something called the yam system, and this thing was extraordinary. Imagine you're trying to control an empire that spans 4,000 miles from east to west. 4,000 miles, no phones, no telegraphs, no railways. How do you send orders? How do you gather intelligence? How do you coordinate movements? The yam was a network of relay stations positioned every 20 to 40 miles across the entire empire. Fresh horses at each station, food, shelter, supplies. Official messengers could swap horses up to 10 times a day, covering 200 to 300 miles in 24 hours. For context, that's faster than most communication systems until the invention of the telegraph 600 years later. But here's the financial genius. The yam wasn't just for messages. It was a supply chain, a logistics network that moved resources, troops, and intelligence at speeds no other empire could match. And who paid for it? The conquered territories. The relay stations were maintained by local populations as part of their tax obligations. So the Mongols built the world's most advanced communication and logistics system, and they did it using other people's money and labor. The yam turned administrative overhead into externalized costs. Modern military theorists call this force multiplication. The Mongols invented it 800 years ago. Third, innovation. Risk externalization. This is the darkest part, but it's also the most important to understand. Traditional armies carried their own supplies, their own food, weapons, siege equipment. This created a logistical tail, a supply chain that limited how far and how fast you could move. The Mongols eliminated this entirely. When Mongol armies invaded, they traveled light. Incredibly light. How? Because they didn't plan to feed themselves from home. They planned to feed themselves from the territories they invaded, not through random looting. Through systematic requisitioning backed by their tax census data, they knew exactly which regions could supply grain, which could supply horses, which had craftsmen who could repair equipment or build siege weapons, and they timed their invasions accordingly. But here's the crucial part. This wasn't plunder. Plunder is destructive. You take everything, burn what's left, and move on. The Mongols were more sophisticated. They took enough to sustain their army, but not so much that the region couldn't recover, because they needed that region to keep producing, to keep paying taxes, to potentially supply future campaigns. This is risk externalization. The costs of warfare, the costs of feeding and equipping armies, were transferred entirely to the conquered territories, not through chaos, but through system, through careful calculation and record keeping that would make a modern accountant proud. And this created something unprecedented, a military machine that got stronger with every conquest. Each new territory didn't drain resources, it added resources, added tax base, added supply nodes for the yam network, added recruitment pools for future armies. The more the Mongols conquered, the more they could conquer. The math that destroyed other empires was working in reverse. But there's one more thing people always get wrong about the Mongols. They think plunder equals profit. It doesn't. It never has. Plunder is a one-time score. You grab the gold, the silk, the slaves, and you're done. That's finite. That's a depleting asset. Taxes are infinite. Taxes are renewable. As long as the conquered region remains productive, the revenue stream continues forever. The Mongols understood this instinctively. Yeah, they took plunder when they could, but they built their system on taxes, on systematic, predictable, renewable extraction of wealth from territories that had every incentive to keep producing. This is why Mongol-conquered regions sometimes experienced economic growth under occupation. It sounds crazy, but it's documented. Parts of Persia, parts of China, actually became more prosperous after Mongol conquest because the tax system was more rational and predictable than what had come before. The Mongols had invented the first truly scalable model of imperial finance, a system where the empire funded its own expansion through the territories it had already conquered, where growth created the resources for more growth. All right, theory is one thing, but did it actually work? Let's look at the evidence. When the Mongols conquered the Jin dynasty in northern China between 1211 and 1234, they inherited a devastated economy. Decades of warfare, collapsed infrastructure, shattered trade networks. By all traditional measures, this territory should have been a drain on resources. Instead, within a decade, northern China was funding Mongol expansion into Persia, into Russia, into Central Asia. How? First, they implemented that census system. Shigi Kutok, one of Genghis Khan's adopted sons, directed a comprehensive population count in 1235 and 1236. They registered approximately 1.73 million households, counted fields, vineyards, livestock assets, built a complete economic database of the region. Then they systematized taxation. They combined existing Chinese systems, the two-tax system from the south and the triple-tax system from the north, and created a hybrid that was more efficient than either poll taxes combined with land taxes, combined with profit taxes, all carefully calibrated to maximize revenue without destroying productive capacity. The result? Within a generation, northern China was generating enough tax revenue to finance multiple simultaneous military campaigns across Eurasia. The territory that should have been a burden became an economic engine, and this pattern repeated everywhere the Mongols conquered. When Batu Khan invaded Russia between 1237 and 1240, he didn't just destroy cities, he installed a tribute system managed through local Russian princes. Around 1259, this was formalized into a regular census-based tax collection. Russian principalities paid tribute in furs, silver, and goods. These resources flowed back to the Mongol heartland and then got redistributed to fund campaigns elsewhere. The Russian tribute system alone generated enough wealth to maintain the Golden Horde as an independent military power for over 200 years. Think about that, 2 centuries of military operations funded primarily by taxes from conquered territories. Look at the Mongol conquest of Persia. When Hulagu Khan took Baghdad in 1258, he inherited one of the wealthiest regions in the medieval world. The Ilkhanate, the Persian division of the Mongol Empire, became a self-sustaining economic unit almost immediately. Persian taxes funded administration, funded armies, funded infrastructure projects that actually improved the region's productivity. And here's the thing that really proves the system worked. The different parts of the Mongol Empire started trading with each other systematically through a mechanism called kubi, the traditional system of shares, formalized by Genghis Khan. Under kubi, every member of the royal family was entitled to a share of wealth from every part of the empire. These shares were paid in kind. Mongols ruling in Persia would send spices, steel, jewels, and pearls to their relatives in China. The rulers in China would send porcelain, silk, and medicine back to Persia. This wasn't charity. This was internal trade, a massive redistribution network that moved resources from where they were abundant to where they were scarce. And it was all funded by the tax systems in each region. The empire had created a self-balancing economic ecosystem. Regions that generated surpluses in certain goods would export those goods to regions that had deficits. All tracked, all recorded, all managed through the same census and administrative systems that managed taxation. And the YAM network made this possible. Remember those relay stations every 20 to 40 miles? They weren't just for messages. They were for moving goods, for moving people, for moving wealth. The YAM connected production centers in China with consumption centers in Persia, with military staging areas in Central Asia. It was the world's first true logistics network, and it was entirely self-funding. By the time Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, the Mongol Empire had become the most economically integrated territory in human history. You could travel from Korea to Hungary using the same postal system, the same relay stations, under the same security guarantees. Merchants loved this. Marco Polo's famous journey was only possible because of Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. He carried a golden tablet, a pesa, that granted him access to the YAM network. Free horses, free food, free protection, all paid for by the imperial tax system. And all of that trade taxed customs duties at major cities. Merchant taxes on goods in transit, the Mongols took a cut of everything moving through their empire. The system scaled. That's the key insight. Every conquest added territory, which added tax base, which added relay stations, which improved logistics, which enabled more conquests. For about a century, from 1230 to 1330, this machine was unstoppable, the largest empire in human history, and it paid for itself. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because that Mongol system, it never went away. It just evolved. Modern militaries still use every principle the Mongols invented. They've just gotten better at hiding it. Start with externalized costs. The United States has spent over $14 trillion on defense since 2001. $14 trillion. Where did that money come from? Not from raising taxes, from borrowing, from issuing debt that future generations will pay off. The cost of warfare has been externalized across time. Present benefits, future costs. The Mongols extracted from conquered territories, modern powers extract from future taxpayers. Different mechanism, same principle. Or look at defense contractors. Between 2020 and 2024, just 5 companies received $771 billion in Pentagon contracts. Lockheed Martin alone got $313 billion. That's more than the entire GDP of most countries. These companies don't build weapons and then try to sell them. They get paid to develop weapons, paid again to build them, paid again to maintain them, and a lot of that payment comes before delivery. It's called progress financing. During COVID, the Pentagon increased progress payment rates from 80 to 90% for large businesses and 90 to 95% for small businesses. They provided over $6 billion in additional financing to the defense industrial base, money flowing to contractors before the work was even done. This is tribute as systematic extraction. The government takes money from taxpayers, funnels it to contractors who turn it into political power through lobbying, and campaign contributions, which ensures more contracts get written. The Mongols used conquered territories to fund expansion. Modern military-industrial systems use political capture to ensure continuous funding regardless of strategic necessity. And those contractors, over half of Pentagon spending goes to private companies, not for goods delivered, for contracts awarded, for promises of future capability. The F-35 fighter program has cost over $1.7 trillion when you include maintenance. $1.7 trillion for a plane that still has serious operational issues. But Lockheed Martin got paid anyway, because the system isn't designed to deliver weapons efficiently. It's designed to transfer wealth reliably. Then there's the modern version of the YAM system, except now it's called logistics networks and forward operating bases. The United States maintains about 750 military installations in more than 80 countries. 750. These aren't random. They're positioned to create global reach, to move forces and supplies anywhere in the world within days. And who pays for them? Host nations, through various agreements. Burden-sharing arrangements where allies pay for the privilege of hosting American forces. Or through offset deals where arms sales are tied to basing rights. The infrastructure of global military power is externalized onto partners and allies. Just like the Mongol relay stations were externalized onto conquered populations, look at Ukraine aid since 2022, $65 billion. But most of that money doesn't go to Ukraine. It goes to American defense contractors to replace weapon systems that get sent to Ukraine. The money circulates through the domestic economy while the equipment goes overseas. Or the $18 billion to Israel in the year after October 2023. That's not cash transfers. That's weapon systems built by American companies, paid for by American taxpayers, delivered to Israel. The Mongols used the Kube system to move resources from China to Persia to fund campaigns in Russia. Modern military aid moves weapons from American factories to conflict zones, while ensuring domestic contractors stay profitable. The mechanisms have changed. The core logic hasn't. And just like the Mongols, modern military systems have figured out how to make warfare self-sustaining through institutional structures. Not because any individual wants endless war, but because the system creates incentives that perpetuate themselves. Defense companies need contracts to survive. Politicians need defense jobs in their districts to get re-elected. Military brass want budgets to maintain readiness. None of these are nefarious on their own, but together they create a logic that resists scaling down. The Mongol system made conquest profitable. The modern system makes military spending politically essential. There's a reason Pentagon budgets keep growing, even when major wars end. Even when the stated threats change, the system has become self-justifying. Between 2020 and 2024, Pentagon spending averaged about $800 billion per year. That's with no major conventional wars, no peer conflict, just baseline operations and modernization. Compare that to diplomatic and development spending. $356 billion over the same period, less than half. The United States spent more than twice as much on 5 weapons companies as it did on all diplomacy, development, and humanitarian aid combined. This isn't strategy, this is structural. The system has evolved to prioritize military spending because that's where the money flows. That's where the political power accumulates. That's what the institutional incentives reward. The Mongols built a system where conquest funded more conquest. Modern powers have built a system where military spending justifies more military spending. Different contexts, same underlying dynamic, and it raises the same question the Mongol Empire eventually faced. What happens when the system stops expanding? When there are no new territories to conquer, no new threats to justify increased budgets? For the Mongols, the answer was fragmentation. Civil war, collapse. The system that made expansion inevitable made stability impossible. What's the answer for modern military-industrial systems? We're about to find out. So here's what the Mongol Empire teaches us. Not about Nestre, about now. When you build a system where war pays for itself, you create an engine that resists being turned off. The Mongols proved this. For 100 years, their empire expanded because expansion was profitable, because the financial logic rewarded conquest. But there's a corollary nobody talks about. When war becomes systematically profitable, it doesn't stop for moral reasons. It doesn't stop for strategic reasons. It only stops when the math stops working. The Mongol Empire didn't fall because anyone defeated them militarily. It fell because the system fragmented, because the different khanates started competing with each other, because the unified financial structure that made expansion possible broke down into rival power centers. But for a century before that collapse, the system worked perfectly. It turned nomadic raiders into the administrators of the largest empire in human history. It financed unprecedented military campaigns across 3 continents. It integrated economies from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, all based on 3 core principles: systematic taxation of conquered territories, externalized logistics costs, and self-reinforcing expansion incentives. Those principles didn't die with the Mongol Empire. They evolved. They became more sophisticated, more embedded in institutional structures, harder to see, harder to challenge. Modern military spending isn't driven by shadowy conspiracies. It's driven by the same logic that drove Mongol expansion, a system where the financial incentives align with continued operation, where stopping costs more politically than continuing, where the apparatus of war becomes too big, too complex, too economically integrated to wind down. The Mongol innovation was making conquest self-funding. The modern innovation is making military spending self-justifying. And just like the Mongol system, it works spectacularly well. Until it doesn't, the question isn't whether these systems are efficient. They are. The Mongols proved that systematic financial exploitation can fund empire for generations. The question is, what happens when the expansion stops, when the territories are conquered, when the budgets plateau? Because that's when systems built on growth face their moment of truth. That's when the financial logic that enabled rise becomes the structural weakness that causes collapse. The Mongols never figured out how to transition from expansion to stability. Their system required conquest. When conquest stopped, the empire ate itself. We're running the same experiment, just with bigger budgets, more sophisticated weapons, more elaborate institutional structures. The Mongols showed us that when war pays for itself, it doesn't stop. 800 years later, we're still learning what that means. And the lesson is both simpler and darker than anyone wants to admit. Systems don't stop because they should. They stop because they must. Because the math finally breaks. Because the costs can't be externalized anymore. Because the future runs out. The secret financial system behind the Mongol Empire wasn't really secret. It was just invisible to people inside it. Just like ours is invisible to us. Until it isn't. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how financial systems shaped military power, Check out the next video where we explore how the Mongol paper currency experiment foreshadowed every modern economic crisis. If you appreciate this kind of historical analysis, consider subscribing and like the video. We're just getting started. Thanks for watching.